Welcome to the Ag Culture Podcast, where we cultivate tomorrow by inspiring agripreneurs and ag innovators through real-life global perspectives in agriculture. I'm Paul Windemaller, your host on this journey of exploration and growth. On this episode, I had the chance to chat with our guest, Alex Peterson, in person. Alex is first and foremost co-owner of Peterson Dairy in Trenton, Missouri, as well as chairman of both the U.S. Dairy Export Council and the United Dairy Industry Association. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of being engaged as a leader in agriculture, as well as the things he learned in traveling around the world, looking at dairy markets globally. But before we get into the interview, I would like to ask that if you find value in our podcast, please subscribe and share it with someone you know. We'd really appreciate it. Now, on to the interview with Alex. All right, I'm here today with Alex Peterson. Alex, where are we at today?
Today, we're at the National Milk Producers Federation, United Dairy Industry Association, and National Dairy Promotion and Research Board joint annual meeting in Orlando, Florida.
That's why I had him say that, because I never remember that. But welcome to today's podcast, and I have Alex Peterson, that is the chairman for United States Dairy Export Council. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I got that one right.
USDEC.
All right, USDEC. What other roles do you have in the industry, Alex?
Currently, I'm the vice chair for the United Dairy Industry Association, and I am on DFA's Central Area Council.
Great. And you're from Central Missouri.
Yeah, North Central Missouri.
So Central Missouri and United Dairy Export Council, you're going global. How does a farmer from Central Missouri have interest in global aspirations?
You
Tell
say
me about that.
You say that like I'm the farthest farmer from any export market, which I pretty close to.
You're probably within, 5 miles of that?
Yeah. Okay. There's a pinpoint. But exports are are a major driver of demand for U.S. dairy products, which drives sales, which drives price. And even though most of my milk is going to fluid that's not leaving the state of Missouri, exports have a huge impact on my farm's bottom line, just as it does every dairy farm in the country. So I know it rings home, so that's why it becomes important.
Right. And right now it's roughly 20% of the U.S. milk production goes overseas. Is that right?
So last year we were at 18%, which would be like hitting 60 home runs. This year we're hitting like 45 home runs. We're down a little bit in 2023, but it's still a really good year and still a huge part of where we're at. Considering 25 years ago, it was more like 4% of exports on a lot smaller base.
Great. And so let's give the audience a little background. In Central Missouri, what's your story?
150 cows on a management-intensive grazing dairy and dairy farm with my parents, my oldest brother, and my niece. And we love what we do. It's not always easy, but I think dairy farming, the beauty of it is whatever cards you're kind of dealt, and that including your management, desire or how you want to run a business, you can kind of find that, but the land dictates a lot. So I'm from, we call it the Green Hills region because it's a little too rolling of the hills for row crops to be dominant everywhere. So we have a lot of beef cattle. And so we kind of embrace the grazing aspect of where we're from, and really I found a really good model to keep a low cost dairy, but have pretty good production and survive, which is the name of the game. Survive and advance.
Awesome. And you're relatively young in the dairy industry, as I am. We're very, very similar in age here. And how did you get started in a leadership role and develop yourself in a career outside of just your farm in the dairy industry?
So it really took a guy named Bill Siebenborn, who's a farmer from 6-7 miles away, who was a really big leader in dairy. And he kind of came alongside me early on and said, hey, you need to be doing this And really, it's tough to tell. There's like 18 inches of difference between a pat on the back and a kick in the butt. I'm not exactly sure where the encouragement was, but it was somewhere there. And then once you kind of get started, and in this industry, when someone sees that you have an interest in leadership, which I don't know how much of an interest I had, I just kind of showed up, and then they kind of jump on you for opportunities if you show any kind of aptitude for it. Because there is a kind of a void in leadership. Our industry, I don't think, is dissimilar to a lot of other industries where there's a heavy population of, the boomer generation, and they're at retirement age, stepping aside age, and there's kind of a void of leadership that they're kind of leaving in their wake. And I think some of the more intentional leaders of that group did a good job of saying, hey, who's on deck, who's on the bench, and what do we need to do to fill that bench so that there's not a gap in leadership. And I think I was one of those that kind of got swept up in that kind of initial round. And because our farm is structured a kind of a way where I can get away some, that I think that's the key. A lot of people our age, have families and a budding career, and it's tough to commit to being gone 3 or 4 days, a time or two a month. It's a significant commitment.
So what are some of the skills that you learned along the way or that you look at and say, wow, I really need to develop this in order to get to that next step in leadership?
Yeah, communication skills, for sure. Listening and understanding. I think farmers kind of have a tendency to have never reported to anybody other than themselves. And so, you're dealing with CEOs with maybe a little bit of a God complex sometimes too. And I think really kind of meeting them where they are and understanding where they come from, and realizing that farmers just about all have a really good perspective on things, even though they are very different perspectives, but kind of hearing them out, understanding, and then not being afraid to assert a solution, offer a solution, and have some supporting evidence to back it up. And I think there's a lot of ease that comes to a situation when a young leader steps in and can very thoughtfully ask, why do we do it like this? Mm-hmm. And because I don't want to change anything without fully understanding why this system's in place and how it functions. But when you find those out, sometimes it's very evident. It's like, oh yeah, we did this because so and so wanted to do it, and he was crazy, but he wanted to do it. And so I think there's ways to kind of advance by just kind of asking good questions and not getting an ego about the whole thing. And I think that was something I kind of had to learn, was you have to really check your ego at the door, which I was the youngest of 3 brothers on a dairy farm. I didn't have an ego initially, but it
got beat out of you, right?
It got beat out of me. I cried that out really early on in life. But I think that's a big part of really being there to serve. And people say that all the time, but it actually takes a little effort to be okay with losing an election. It takes okay for your idea not to. Yeah, it was just an idea. Like, I didn't own it. I just offered it up, and if it works, great, and if not, fine. But I think kind of being there for the right reasons is a big part of what it takes.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to really gain that perspective before you speak or before you open your mouth and say, this is how it needs to be. And I think as a young person, we can kind of jump to that pretty quick. I know I'm guilty of that myself. Yeah. So that's a great point. So tell us a little bit about your experience with US Deck. I know you had many travels overseas, abroad. What were some of the most impactful ones, and what were some of the lessons that you learned through those trips?
So growing up in the US, we're kind of used to like US business, which is, low bid with a good enough quality. That's where you're going to give your business to. A lot of the other cultures in the world is still very relational. They want to know who they're doing business with. They need to develop that rapport. And the degree to which that relationship is strong is the degree to which it will survive ebbs and flows in the market. And people really want to know and love and trust who they do business with. And that's not, we live in a world where the sales rep pulls in the driveway and, your blood pressure goes up 5 points without even thinking of it. But a lot of the world, they want to meet who they're doing business with. And we have staff who are building those relationships and solving problems and making it easy to export dairy products. But farmers, whenever they show up in Dubai or Japan or Singapore or South Korea, they immediately become like the superstars of the thing, because these companies and these consumers, what they meet where their food is actually coming from. And especially in like these big cities where the consumers are, that they may not have met a farmer ever. and are so many generations removed that it's just so foreign to them. But they really develop it. So when we go on these trade missions, we meet with USDA, Foreign Ag Service, like the U.S. government's representation there, which they always know we're there. Mm-hmm. And it kind of helps at least them dust off their dairy notebook a little bit. And, that way they know what we call then local government officials. But then we meet with chefs is a big thing what we do. Social media influencers. It's not hard to find social media influencers, and we're a great bait for content. So it's a win-win for both of us. I mean, look, you got a podcast, so you get it.
Worked for us.
and then meeting other farmers too, because it's kind of counterintuitive that we would want these dairy farmers to do well. It's like that's our competition. But the best thing for dairy sales and consumption is for the local producers to have a good attitude and a good spirit and good production models, because it's hard to sell something whenever there's a bad representation of it locally. So we can go in, and we've proven that we can build the pie enough that we're going to have expanded markets, and they're going to do better too. And I think Mexico is kind of like the prime example of that, where they were importing like 30% of their dairy products 30 years ago. Today, they're still importing 30%, but the pie is immensely bigger, and we're selling a ton more there. But their farmers are happy because they've got a bigger chunk to eat too, which is really good.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I don't think a lot of farmers really think about that outside their market, right? I need to move this product outside of my market, and the pie is only so big for the market, and we're competing, right? But what you're talking about is collaborating with other sectors or the same sector in other areas and being able to build that demand stronger. And I think we've seen that in the U.S. As well, working with other sectors, but doing that overseas with other dairy industry partners. I think that's a great perspective that many people don't think of. So appreciate that.
And we're always going to be like Mexico. It's always going to be hard to export fluid, right, which is always going to be the premium product. So if you can grow it, they're always going to take the fluid market first, and then we're going to supply the other things: cheese, powders, proteins. And so that it really works well for us in dairy.
Have you had any other paradigm shift moments on your travels overseas that you can think of that just really shifted how you think about marketing or about the dairy industry in general?
How kind of cutthroat it can be out there in the world. So, we have competitors in the world, the EU, New Zealand, a few others to some degree, but how tough it can be whenever you're facing non-tariff trade barriers, trade agreements, difference in how governments work. So U.S. Dairy Export Council, we get some funding from the people selling dairy products. There's a fee to be a member. And so that money isn't checkoff money. So we can use that money for like trade policy and working with government relations that we can't do with checkoff funds. And so as we deal with our government and their governments and other governments in the world that are always trying to help their farmers out, I think I didn't realize, I was pretty naive to how much is going on under the surface and how important it is to have very savvy operators working hard to defend our interests and our opportunity to market access, which, I mean, that's the most coveted thing is if you can get market access, great. If you can get your kind of elbows out around your bowl of territory and keep everybody else out, all the better. And I think the U.S., we kind of have a stance of, hey, we just give us a fair shot. And I don't think we don't push other people out as much as some of the other parts of the world do. But with a level playing field, we know that we're going to outcompete just about everybody. So, but that was an eye opener how ugly it can be out there in the world.
Kind of a slugfest some days, huh?
Mm-hmm.
All right, Alex, let's go back to your farm and your career in farming. So you said you're a third generation dairy farmer.
Correct.
So there's a lot of history there, right? So how does that weigh in on how you make decisions and how you run your business and how you look toward the future?
Probably a lot more so than it should. Is that the right answer?
I don't know. I'm a first generation dairyman. So
yeah. So I think I'm kind of proud of our farm in that we, even though we're third generation, each generation has had kind of their own take on it. We've had some kind of paradigm shifts in how we function. As I said, we were grazing. We didn't used to be a grazing dairy. We used to be a conventional dairy. And we kind of made a pretty big leap to switch from that. And that was kind of like Dad's generational shift. And I think, conservatively, like I said before, you want to make sure you fully understand why we do things before you go jumping in wholesale and changing. But I think we live in a dynamic enough industry that you constantly need to be looking for ways to be more efficient, ways to be better steward, ways to be pulling up production and making the most of what you have, which is, that's agricultural 101 is how do I do more with less? Because everything costs. And that's why we're some of the best sustainability stories on the planet is whenever, as President Kennedy said, ag is the one area where they buy everything at retail, sell everything at wholesale, and pay the hauling both ways. And I think when you're in that crunch, I think you're forced to be innovative. And I think that is a legacy that not all farms pass down is, hey, we're all for doing whatever you got to do to be better. And I think we've been lucky that my brother who farms with me, mechanical engineer, so he's got that mindset. Like he is, if I put a problem in front of him, he will figure it out and make it work. Sometimes I can't keep stuff broke for him to fix, but I'm more of like a global thinker. And
You're obviously the PR guy, right?
I get to be the PR guy. Yeah, he hates people, which is good. Loves cows and hates people. But I think having a good balance on who is in your farm. I think sometimes with generational farms, you end up with a carbon copy of the generation before you. Maybe I may be reading too much into that, but I think understanding how to complement the generations before instead of imitate the generations before is kind of the best mark forward.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most inspirational things I've ever heard said about it. Complement.
Yeah.
But what was that? Don't duplicate?
Yeah. I can't remember what I said now, but complement, but not imitate.
Yeah, there you go.
But not, because that's that way in business. You don't want to, if you have an expertise, you don't hire 5 people that are exactly like you.
Right.
Because that's your expertise. You hire what you don't have for a skill set. And I think like good succession planning, they have to, hey, go out and do a job for 4 or 5 years and bring a skill back that we need. I think that's kind of the right mentality. What skill do we need? And we were lucky enough that our personalities were different than our parents' personalities and skill sets, and we were able to really kind of plug some holes.
Oh, that's great. Alex, what do you see as your legacy with your farm and your legacy in this industry?
Don't screw it up.
For which one? Both?
Yeah. No, that's the burden of leadership, I think. No, so you always want to leave it better than you found it. And some days it feels like I'm making good progress on one. Some days good progress on both. Some days it feels you're taking a step back. But in both cases, if you find and develop good leaders around you, and that was a lesson I kind of learned too, is you don't want to be the person that does it all. Sometimes the best thing for everybody is for you to say no. I have respect for my yeses. I have to say no, or however you want to phrase it. But the best thing is to make everybody else around you better. Kind of the Michael Jordan of things. You got to have a full team, and you can't just pull all the weight yourself. Not that I'm capable of that, but that's the mentality you have to have. But as far as legacy goes, I think it's important to demonstrate that you can be a grazing dairy farmer from Missouri and have an impact on U.S. dairy exports. Because that doesn't like jive super well, logically to most farmers. But when you really dive into it, it's not that big of a leap.
Right.
And so I think the legacy is helping farmers understand that we are a global market. And there are some farmers that don't think we should export anything, defies economics. But I think helping them understand what we do, how we do, and the value of it is critically important. And streamlining the organizations and process that we have. It's like anything else. When when you add a program, add a committee, add an association, at some point you need to say, hey, okay, these are all the things that we are doing. Here are all the things that we need to be doing. What do we need to roll off to another organization, or what can be, evolved out? And I think the same way is true on the farm. You can't just keep adding processes or systems. You need to figure out ways to streamline. Elon Musk said, one of my favorite quotes from him is, the biggest mistake that engineers make is optimizing a system that shouldn't exist. Which is so true. And I find my engineering brother doing that too. Why are you fixing this thing that we don't even need? And I think it's important that we are being deliberate on what legacies we're taking, because the last thing I want is a legacy of something that we didn't really need to begin with.
Right.
So
that's a great point. Great point. Where do you see the U.S. dairy industry going? I mean, you're at a lot of events. You're around a lot of the people that are making things happen in the industry in the U.S. Where do you see the industry going in the U.S. and where do you think exports will be going in the future?
So in the U.S., I think this next generation of dairy farming, farmer leaders, I think they've got some big decisions to make on where production happens. And, unfortunately, a lot of that's kind of the government regulations and environmental constraints are going to be factors in that. But I think we are getting so much better at being nimble and adaptive. And, the loop of how quick innovation happens and change happens is getting so tight. I mean, things are changing so fast that our adaptability, I think, has always been the envy of industry. But I think we're getting so much better at that as we are better at communicating. Like a podcast like this, my grandfather, he knew what was going on at the feed mill, at the exchange. Those 20 farmers, he knew what was going on their farms, and that was it. My parents' generation, they kind of knew what was going on in the state, maybe the Midwest, through some publications and things like that. Now, I know what's going on a farm in Hokkaido, Japan, and in France, and in New Zealand. I mean, so the world has gotten smaller. So instead of having a few farms kind of be the research farms, or a few universities having research farms, every farm is a research farm now. And every farm is a station where we are learning and gathering information from. And since dairy is still an independent industry, there's always a farm that's building a new parlor, that's building a new cropping system, that's working on a new feed system. And so we are one of the few areas where we're segmented enough that change and improvement is always occurring somewhere. And it's a matter of getting information and feedback back to the system. And I think we're really good about sharing successes and sharing failures, which is oftentimes way more valuable.
Right. You learn more from your failures usually than your successes.
And I think you talk about legacy and generation. I think that's what keeps us more so than other industries from paying the tuition of having a failure. A lot of companies and businesses and professionals, they hit a couple rough patches and they quit and you do something else. I mean, take a new job, work down the street, no big deal. We're locked in a little more. And so we pay that tuition and actually learn from it and then figure out how to improve and keep going. As failure, people don't really fail, they just quit at some point. And so I think we do a good job of maybe not quitting. And that's why we've kind of pushed the envelope a little more. So I'm kind of excited about U.S. dairy because we're one of the few places on earth that have kind of potential to continue to grow. I mean, whether you're talking about governmental constraints, land constraints, water constraints, we've kind of got it all, and we have a lot more runway if we elect to go that route. And I think we will in a lot of aspects. And I think that's the big play internationally. We talk, as I segue to the export side of things. If you're a business in Dubai buying dairy products, who do you want to tie your cart with?
Somebody that's going to be able to produce what you need, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's business 101. Yeah. And honestly, that's a huge selling point for us is we will, with the slightest price signal, we will produce a crap load more milk, like kind of the drop of a hat. And that is not the case in most of the world. So we've got the means, motive, and opportunity. And I think it's up to us to kind of continue to develop that opportunity. And, the geopolitics of the world is kind of in a lot of flux right now. But at the end of the day, people will always land on nutrition as a pillar of what people need, of what governments need to provide for their people. And we're kind of top of that hierarchy for that. So
great points. Since COVID, you've heard of the trend of deglobalization. That's been a talk for the last couple of years. Do you believe that's a real thing? Do you see that in your role in the U.S. Dairy Export Council, or are we going to continue to plow forward like we have been over the last decade?
I think there's a lot of industries that are deglobalizing to an extent. You hear the term nearshoring, friendshoring, you're a little more strategic about where you have supply chains and systems in place. So I've seen is Mexico, for example, is kind of booming at this point. So part of the reason we're having a record year this year in Mexico in dairy sales is their economy is doing incredibly well because a lot of U.S. manufacturing is bringing some of that Southeast Asia manufacturing to Mexico. And they've got a huge population, 130 million people, and a huge middle class, growing middle class. And that's why the peso is, I think it's down a little bit the last few months, but when I was there late September, the peso was up 17% on the dollar for the year. So, the dollar's been strong against most currencies through the world, kind of through the pandemic and lately, but the peso's been doing really well because they've got a super strong economy with a lot of young people that are really demand generators. Mm-hmm. So I think if there does continue to be this deglobalization, nearshoring, I think we're set up well for that. Granted, I would rather keep all the markets open to the world. And I don't wonder if food and nutrition kind of supersedes some deglobalization. So maybe we have some level of immunity to that, but there's always going to be, governmental issues getting stuff in and out. But that's why US DEC works real hard to keep those lanes open. But no, I think there is that tendency for deglobalization when there's friction, and there's going to be more and more friction throughout the world. But food is one of those things that I think kind of helps keep things tied together. Mm-hmm. And with Mexico specifically, issues at the border, agriculture is a great story to have as background for that. It's there's these things going on that are issues, 100%, but there's so much food and ag that goes each way at the border that is critical for both of our economies. And we got to keep in mind the whole picture of what's going on and not just, the horrible things that we see. But there are a reason that our economies are so intertwined. And that's, I think it's like the heaviest economic border in the world because so much of what we do coincides with that. And I think it's only going to get more important.
So you've been to several places around the world. Personally, what's been your favorite place that you visited and why?
So I loved Japan, really enjoyed Japan, and just friendly, warm people. Tokyo, the largest city in the world, is bananas. There's people everywhere, but they love, we're trying to get them to love pizza more and more. So that's a big selling point, but they're just so kind. They have this tradition that when you have a meeting with somebody, they walk you out to the car and then they stand and wave until you are out of sight. Well, it's a crazy busy city. So their stoplight, you might go 10 feet and then stop and they're just still waving, but so kind and sincere. And even when you back out on the airplane, they taxi you out, the little guys on the ground crew, they just stand in a row and wave until your plane takes off. Kills efficiency, I would think, productivity. But no, they were really nice. And the farmers there were incredible. We got to meet with some of their farmers, just really, really cool people.
Awesome. That sounds like a place I want to visit.
Yeah, it's nice.
So do you have any future aspirations or roles that you'd like to be in someday or that interest you in the future?
I would have said 5 or 6 years ago, I would have had a list of things that I like to do. But what happened was so much better than what I had planned that I'm just going to stick to doing well at where I'm able to serve now. And if opportunities come, great. And if not, great. I have a principle that no matter what role I'm in, the ideal is to find somebody better than me and get them into that role. And I've got a couple success stories, like even from like a local school board that I, was able to get out, like serve my 2 terms, but found somebody way better than me to serve. And that's the best legacy that you can leave is not just it better off, but it better served ongoing. So and that's the number one rule of leaders is to make more leaders. So,
yeah, that's a great point, and something that every industry needs to do in order to stay viable, right?
Yeah, I would love nothing more than to stay home and milk cows all the time. Like that's what I really love. But all of this other things need to happen for that dream to continue. So that's kind of the motivation of what we're doing.
What are some of your life-defining moments you care to share?
Yeah, I think so. My faith, number one, like. If I wasn't a person of integrity, I wouldn't be doing any of this because people would have already seen that I'm a phony. So I think integrity is number one, and that's where that's stemmed from. Life-defining moments. So as far as dairy goes, when I got appointed to the National Dairy Board 6 years ago, kind of as relatively unknown at that point, and that kind of spiraled me into the national scene. And has allowed kind of leadership to grow there. Life defining. Oh man, that's a good question.
You didn't think you were going to have to think this deep today, did you?
No, I thought it was just going to be export numbers, which you can off the top of your head. What do you have for life defining moments? Maybe I can copy one of yours. Oh, see, it's not as fun now.
I got them on my phone. I actually did an exercise back, probably a month ago, and I thought about it for probably 3 hours and had a list. I think there's 6 things. But one of my life-defining moments that I had was I witnessed one of my uncles and a good friend of mine pass away in front of me.
Oh.
And I tell that story because it was a really hard moment in life. I was 9 years old at the time. But that really helped me understand how valuable life is and how quick it can be gone. And for me, that really made a big impact on the decisions that I made for my life. And like God put me here for a purpose, and I don't have time to waste to get there, right? And to serve that purpose out. So that's probably one of my biggest life-defining moments that I've had.
Yeah, I think I can't top that. That's a good one. Man. No, it's been amazing. The constellations of things that happen that kind of define who you are and how you function. And
I think the threads of relationships through life, like you were talking about the gentleman that helped you kind of get into the industry roles that you're in now, that I look back on life, those fine threads of relationships of how I, quote unquote, randomly met this person. And then all of a sudden that led to another relationship that led to a very big turning point in my life. And it sounds like you've had those similar experiences.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And there's a few that are not, they're not podcast worthy, but absolutely little ones where somebody saw something and instead of just being like, oh, that's cool, they actually stepped into action and said, hey, why don't you think about this? Or why don't you do this? And give a little encouragement or opportunity. And I think that's something that we need to continue to be deliberate on. I've got a friend who, I think I got it from a podcast, but he, like every night his kids, before they go to bed, he asks them, what is something somebody did for you, like something nice that somebody did for you today? And what's something nice you did for somebody else today? To really even just get them thinking about, oh, that was, because sometimes we don't train ourselves to recognize like, oh, that was very, like, this person went out of their way. They made an effort. And then what can I do to make an effort to help and support? And I think in today's society, that's not ingrained in us to be supportive of others and to be like, go out of our way. It's, get out of my way. It's kind of the mentality. And I think that's kind of the opposite of where dairy is going, where I want to see us go, is that we are really all in this together. And the best thing for people and dairy farmers anywhere is for dairy farmers everywhere to do well. And that takes some effort and work and looking out for each other.
10, 15 years ago, let's hear from the younger version of Alex. What if you could go back to your younger version 10 or 15 years, what advice would you have for yourself?
Push yourself a little bit. It's okay to be uncomfortable. I was like a homebody. I didn't want to do I liked the farm, and I just didn't have much of a worldview, didn't have much of any idea what else was going on in the world around me, and not really an appetite for it. But I think just I would want to push myself to be a little more engaged and have your eyes open to what goes around you. I'm like a late bloomer, like maturity as far as like, oh, there's other things going on here. And I think maybe some of that being pent up is kind of what springboarded me a little heavy into that space, which is maybe the best thing overall. But just to pay attention to what's going on around you and be a little less dumb in everything you're doing. It's amazing. Like, even you look back, it seems like every point in life I could look back like 2 or 3 years and be like, what an idiot. Like, how did you not like see this or understand this? And I think that's kind of like, that's the like quest for knowledge and like personal growth that you have to have. But I think I've been so fortunate that even when I was kind of a moron in a lot of aspects, that there were people that, whether they're just being nice or maybe they saw something, whatever, really kind of put their hand on my shoulder and be like, hey, here's an opportunity, there's an opportunity. And it's not that nobody wants to do that stuff, but sometimes people have to be encouraged to step up. And it's easy to be the person that just does what you love and not anything else, but to understand that what you love is solely determined on a lot of other things happening at the same time.
So you just mentioned personal growth. I know you're a pretty well-read person. What have you been reading lately? What books have really sparked some interest in you?
David Ambrose about Eisenhower. That book was incredibly good. And then I had a friend who was looking out for me, trying to do something nice, recommended Meditations from Marcus Aurelius like 10 years ago. And I just started like 2 weeks ago. Very good. Okay. Very good.
I'll have to put those on my list.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of just like Proverbs, essentially, like just the wisdom that he gleaned, but like on leadership and on kind of seeing people and understanding people and learning from people, and then just kind of self-discipline. Very good. Very good.
Awesome. Well, Alex, I really appreciate your time today and being on the podcast and sharing your wisdom and your roles in the industry, and really appreciate what you do for the dairy industry in the U.S. So thank you very much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks again to Alex for taking the time out of his busy schedule at the conference to have a conversation with us. Check out the show notes and connect with Alex and what he is doing as a young leader in the dairy industry on a global scale. Also, please check us out at agculturepodcast.com. And until next time, stay curious.